Welcome, wanderers of the dark. Tonight is Halloween, the one night when shadows stretch a little further and whispers in the wind might just be real. In this special Halloween compilation, we've gathered tales to chill your spine and haunt your mind long after the final story fades. So, dim the lights, settle in, and remember, tonight, fear is the guest of honor. Happy Halloween, and good luck making it through the night.
The night I became the Pumpkin Carver. Halloween, a night wrapped in eerie allure, draped in whispered stories and unsettling legends. People celebrate Halloween with the playful grin of jack-o'-lanterns, kids darting through darkened streets, and flickering porch lights casting warm glows over the festivity. But that's the surface. Beneath the costumes and candy lies a darker truth. The reason Halloween has always been more than just a holiday. It's a night when the veil between worlds thins, when the things we fear most watch from just beyond our reach. For the ancients, Halloween, or Samhain, was a time of crossing. They believed that spirits and monsters were closest then, that shadows weren't empty but watched. Over the years, we've transformed it into light-hearted fare, a safe venture into the night. But sometimes, all it takes is a single moment to strip away the mask and reveal Halloween's true face. It was the Halloween night that changed everything for me. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and a full moon hung heavy, its glow stark and otherworldly. I was heading to a Halloween party, one of those wild gatherings where costumes blur the lines between who we are and who we want to become. I wore a mask of my own, a twisted, grotesque thing, all angles and shadows, a creation as disturbing as it was fascinating. Perfect for the night, I thought, as I stepped into the house full of laughter, music, and flickering orange lights. As midnight approached, the laughter around me began to fade, replaced by something else, something darker. It was then that a friend nudged me, grinning, and dared me to venture into the woods behind the house, a place that the locals said was older than memory, where Halloween wasn't just celebrated, it was honored.
Come on,
he taunted.
See if you're brave enough to face the real Halloween.
A thrill of fear raced through me, but I didn't hesitate. I left the warm lights of the house behind and stepped into the darkness. With each step, the sounds of the party faded, swallowed by the forest that seemed to close in around me like a living thing, aware and watchful. The trees loomed tall, skeletal, branches stretching overhead like twisted fingers. Leaves crunched underfoot, the only sound in the dense silence. The air grew colder, sharper, and soon I noticed faint lights ahead, flickering orange in the darkness. I was drawn to them, as if they pulsed with an ancient heartbeat, each flicker urging me forward. I emerged into a small clearing illuminated by a circle of jack-o'-lanterns, their carved faces twisted into expressions of agony, malice, and ecstasy. Their light barely touched the figures gathered there, all masked, their faces hidden beneath strange, unsettling visages. Their voices wove through the night in a low, melodic chant that felt like it came from the earth itself, vibrating through my bones, calling to something buried deep inside me. One of them broke from the circle and drifted toward me, their mask a pale, haunting face with hollow eyes that gleamed in the flickering light.
Join us,
they said, a voice smooth as smoke.
Tonight, you can be free. Tonight, you can become one of us.
The invitation was intoxicating. There was something in their eyes, or rather, in the absence of them, a void that promised freedom from everything I'd ever known. My heart raced, caught between fear and fascination, as I found myself stepping forward, the circle closing in around me. They chanted louder, the sound sinking into my chest, filling my lungs, my veins. It was like a ritual, a dark communion, and I was the offering. As I stood among them, the mask on my face began to feel heavier, pressing down, molding to my skin. I could feel it changing me, twisting something inside. A surge of primal hunger unfurled within me, an urge so powerful it overpowered any remnants of fear. I felt my mind stretching, expanding into something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for this moment. I looked at my hands and barely recognized them. They flexed, knuckles knotted and trembling with an urge that made my stomach twist. I wanted to carve, to create, to fashion something beautiful and terrifying, to mark the world in a way that it would remember me forever. And that's when I understood I was no longer myself. I was becoming a story, a legend. The Pumpkin Carver, a figure born of fear and fascination, a shadow that emerges each year to claim the night. The others seemed to sense it too. Their voices grew frenzied, rising and falling, welcoming me into their fold. They were more than masked figures. They were the embodiment of every nightmare that Halloween sought to contain. Together, we were ancient fears, whispers in the dark, memories of a time when people understood what Halloween really meant. When dawn's first light began to edge over the trees, I stumbled back into the forest, my mind swirling with what I'd become. The mask felt like it had fused with my skin, a second face that couldn't be removed, couldn't be forgotten. The Pumpkin Carver was no longer just a mask, it was a part of me. Halloween was no longer just a date on a calendar, it was a call, a summoning. And now, as each October returns, I feel the pull of that night, the whisper of the mask in the back of my mind, urging me to the shadows. I am no longer just another person. I am a shadow on the edge of the light, a tale told in hushed tones, waiting for Halloween, when fear and darkness rule the night. So as you carve your pumpkins and laugh in the dark, remember me. I am the one who waits for Halloween, the darkness that watches, the shadow you glimpse at the edge of the streetlight's glow. Because Halloween isn't just a celebration of what lies beyond the veil. It's a reminder that we all carry a little darkness within, waiting for the night to come alive.
The Last Trick-or-Treater. The autumn wind whispered through bare branches as Margaret prepared her home for Halloween night. She had always loved this holiday. The joy in children's laughter, their colorful costumes bright against the encroaching twilight. As she set her porch light aglow and arranged the candy bowl, however, an unusual heaviness settled in her chest. Something felt different this year. The neighborhood had changed. Children no longer roamed the streets in playful clusters, and many houses sat in darkness, their owners choosing to ignore the night's festivities. Only a few brave souls kept their lights on, and Margaret was determined to keep the spirit alive, even if she was one of the last. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she settled into her rocking chair, waiting. The first trick-or-treaters arrived soon enough, their laughter warming the chilly air. She handed out candy, feeling a flicker of happiness with each small thank you. But as the clock struck 8, a quiet dread seeped into the night. The streets had fallen silent, and her once familiar neighborhood looked like a stranger. She checked her watch, puzzled. It was still early. Normally, children would be lining up at her door. Perhaps the families had decided to go somewhere safer. She shrugged it off, though the unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. Just as she was about to close up for the night, a lone figure appeared at the end of her driveway. A boy no older than 10 shuffled toward her porch in a tattered skeleton costume that hung loosely from his thin frame. His mask obscured his face, but his eyes, hollow, dark, and unblinking, seemed to draw her in.
"Trick or treat,"
he murmured, barely audible, as if the words pained him to say. Margaret's hand froze over the candy bowl, her heart pounding unsteadily. Something about this boy unnerved her, yet she felt compelled to offer him something. She extended her hand, the candies tumbling from her fingers, her voice trembling as she said,
"Happy Halloween."
The boy didn't take the candy. He just stared, unblinking, his silence stretching into the night. Margaret swallowed hard, a chill trickling down her spine.
Are you all right, dear?
She asked, her voice softer, edged with concern. Slowly, he raised a gloved hand to his mask and pulled it off. The face underneath was hauntingly familiar, a face she had last seen a decade ago. Tommy, the boy who used to live next door, the one who had disappeared without a trace all those years back. The search had faded, but Margaret had never shaken the thought of him, lurking in the recesses of her mind, whispering. Her breath caught in her throat.
Tommy?
She stammered, her pulse quickening.
Yes, it's me.
He whispered, his voice low and hollow, like the echo of a memory.
Do you remember what you promised?
Margaret's hands began to tremble. She had always been kind to the children in the neighborhood, but she had known Tommy, known his family, his secrets, his scars. And once, on a dark, stormy night, he had trusted her, pleading for her help with something he never dared tell anyone else. But she had sent him home, dismissing his fears as a child's imagination, whispering to him that he'd be fine.
What are you talking about?
She asked, the words a tight rasp in her throat.
They told me you could help me.
He said, his gaze sharp, penetrating.
I'm trapped, and you're the only one who knows why. You promised you'd help.
Margaret felt a knot twist painfully in her stomach. The night Tommy vanished, she had heard something outside, just a faint cry carried on the wind so easily dismissed. She had gone to bed, locking the doors without looking back. She hadn't told anyone about that sound, had buried it deep with the other secrets of the neighborhood. But now, in the dark, with Tommy's gaze on her, it all clawed back up, undeniable.
I can't help you,
she said, a pleading edge creeping into her voice.
Please, you need to go home.
But the boy took a step closer, his face twisting with a blend of despair and something darker.
I don't have a home, Margaret. You didn't listen when I needed you. And now, you have to let me in.
A sudden cold crept up the porch steps, the air thickening around her. Margaret tried to back away, but she felt rooted to the spot, as though his stare alone had pinned her in place.
You made a promise, Margaret.
He whispered, his voice rising in pitch, his eyes glinting with a hunger that felt centuries old.
They're waiting you now. The others. All of us.
Her breath came shallow now, the weight of unspoken words crushing her chest. She remembered all the nights she'd ignored the faint echoes of footsteps outside, the laughter that grew distant, until one by one, her neighbors left. The children who left. She was alone now, the last one left standing, the last to hold their stories.
No,
She whispered, more to herself than to him.
Let me in.
He demanded, his voice splintering into a chorus, each whisper belonging to a child she had once known, each one stolen away by the darkness she had refused to see.
Let us in.
Margaret stumbled backward, panic seizing her. She grabbed the candy bowl and flung it at him, but he didn't flinch as the candy scattered across the porch. His eyes remained fixed on hers, an unforgiving darkness pooling in his stare. Desperate, she slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her back against the wood as if it would shield her. She could hear them outside now, the whispers scraping at the walls, filling the cracks she had left behind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but when she dialed 911, only static crackled on the other end, a broken line to the world she had ignored. She looked up to see his face pressed against the window, pale and gaunt, his eyes glistening with tears that were no longer his own.
Please.
He murmured, softer now.
Let me in. I'm so cold, Margaret.
As she looked closer, she saw not just Tommy's face, but the faces of all the children who had once run up to her porch, laughing, trusting. Now they stared back, hollow and twisted, a grotesque reflection of her silence.
Get away from me!
She shrieked, but her voice wavered in the cold, dead air. Shadows seeped through the cracks, curling around her ankles, inching toward her. She looked down, saw faces pressing through the floorboards, mouths agape in silent screams.
Join us.
They whispered, their voices merging into a hollow lullaby.
It's time to play.
She turned toward the back door, desperate for escape, but the shadows had already thickened there, a mass of silent, accusing faces. They closed in, their laughter warping into a cacophony that filled her mind, drowning her thoughts. At the center, Tommy stared at her, his small, skeletal grin widening as the shadows swallowed the light.
Now you can never leave,
he whispered, his voice echoing in her mind. And as the darkness enveloped her, Margaret felt a terrible sinking clarity. She had been the one holding the shadows at bay all this time, guarding against her own guilt, her own secrets. Each child she failed, each memory she silenced, had only drawn the darkness closer. The last trick-or-treater had come for her, and this Halloween, there would be no lights left to guide them home. The Hollow Ones. Halloween had always been a quiet affair on Maple Street, the kind where the biggest commotion came from the sound of children in costumes running from house to house, eager to fill their bags with candy. The houses were modestly decorated, with pumpkins on porches and the occasional cobweb draped across a doorway. But this year, something was different. Ethan leaned against his living room window, watching the night unfold. The air outside was cool, the autumn chill creeping into the cracks of his old house. He'd lived here for years, long enough to know everyone on the block. But recently, neighbors had started disappearing. Some sold their homes and left without a word. Others simply vanished. It was strange, but he never thought too much of it. People moved on, lives changed. Tonight, his attention was drawn to the house across the street. The new neighbors had moved in about a month ago. He hadn't met them yet, though they seemed friendly enough, always smiling and waving from a distance. Their yard was different tonight, dressed up in elaborate Halloween decorations, more extravagant than any other house on the block. Life-sized figures stood in the yard, frozen in place, wearing various costumes. At first glance, they looked like your average Halloween props, but something about them unsettled Ethan. From the window, he squinted, trying to make out the details. These figures, there was something off about them. They weren't like the inflatable ghosts or exaggerated skeletons other houses had. They were too real, too lifelike. Their faces were eerily detailed, their skin unnervingly smooth, almost like wax, and their eyes, if you looked close enough, seemed hollow. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself glancing at them again and again. Each time he looked, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He recognized one of the figures, a tall woman dressed in an elegant vintage gown. That face, it looked like Mrs. Johansson, the woman who lived 2 doors down. But Mrs. Johansson had moved out weeks ago, hadn't she? He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. It was just a decoration, but why did it look so much like her? Unable to shake the feeling, Ethan threw on his coat and stepped outside. The night was quiet, save for the distant laughter of children and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He crossed the street, drawn to the yard like a moth to a flame. The closer he got, the more details emerged. The figures weren't props. They were people. People he recognized. Mrs. Johansson was there, standing unnaturally still, her face frozen in a stiff, empty smile. Next to her was Greg, the mailman, his arm outstretched as if he were caught mid-step. His mouth was open, as though trying to shout, but no sound came. Ethan's heart raced as he backed away, bile rising in his throat. These were his neighbors. These were real people, not decorations. He turned, ready to flee, when he noticed them. The new family, standing on their porch, watching him. The father, tall and clean-cut, stood with his hands in his pockets, a smile playing on his lips. His wife, standing beside him, held their teenage daughter's hand, all three of them eerily calm. They looked as though they had been watching him the entire time.
Beautiful night, isn't it?
The father said, his voice smooth, almost too friendly. Ethan opened his mouth to respond but found the words stuck in his throat. The family watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl.
What's going on here?
Ethan finally managed to choke out, his voice shaky. The father glanced at the yard, as if admiring the scene.
We like to keep the spirit of Halloween alive. It's important, don't you think?
Ethan stared at him, heart pounding in his chest.
What did you do to them?
The family exchanged glances, their smiles widening ever so slightly.
They didn't have the spirit anymore.
The mother chimed in, her voice unnervingly soft.
The neighborhood needed a little livening up.
Ethan took a step back, every instinct telling him to run. But something kept him rooted in place. The way they looked at him, it was as though they knew something he didn't. He could feel it, a weight pressing down on him, an unspoken threat in the air. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them making sense. The father stepped closer, his eyes gleaming under the porch light.
You're welcome to join us, you know. It's important to keep the neighborhood lively.
Ethan didn't wait to hear more. He turned and bolted back to his house, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he locked the door and backed away, trembling. He glanced toward the window but couldn't bring himself to look outside again. The house felt colder now, the silence pressing in on him. His reflection caught his eye as he passed the hallway mirror, and for a split second he swore something was wrong. His face, it looked stiff, unnatural, hollow. Ethan shook his head and forced himself to breathe, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at him, that he was being watched, drawn into something far beyond his control. Morning came quietly. The sun rose over Maple Street, casting long shadows across the lawns. Kids rode their bikes past the new neighbor's house, paying no mind to the still figures standing in the yard. Ethan's house was quiet. The blinds were drawn, the door locked. But across the street, a new figure had appeared among the decorations. Standing on the porch, perfectly still, his face frozen in a vacant expression, was Ethan. The family watched from their porch, smiling. The neighborhood had never looked so lively. The Pumpkin Carver.
The air hung heavy with the sweet, spicy scent of autumn as Claire wandered through the bustling town square, her eyes drawn to the sea of orange pumpkins. Each October, the annual Pumpkin Festival transformed their quaint little town into a vibrant celebration of harvest, laughter, and community. This year, however, a foreboding sense of unease clung to her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. She paused in front of a booth adorned with a sign that read, "The best pumpkin carver in the county." The words were scrawled in jagged letters, as if written in haste. Intrigued, Claire leaned closer, observing the intricate carvings on display. Each pumpkin was a masterpiece, glaring faces twisted in agony, grinning skulls, and haunting hollow eyes. It was mesmerizing, yet disturbing, as if the pumpkins were more alive than the people who wandered past, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the darkness looming over them.
Beautiful, aren't they?
A voice drawled, sending a chill racing down her spine. Claire turned to see a tall figure standing beside her, his long fingers stained orange with pumpkin guts, a crooked smile dancing on his lips. He wore an apron splattered with remnants of his craft, and his eyes glinted with an unsettling gleam.
I'm the Pumpkin Carver. Name's Victor. You should see what I can create with just a simple knife.
The invitation hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Claire hesitated but felt a strange pull, a mix of fear and curiosity.
They're amazing,
She replied, forcing a smile.
you must have a gift.
A gift?
He echoed, laughter rumbling in his chest.
You could say that. But the true art comes from understanding the soul of the pumpkin. You have to dig deep, peel away the layers, and expose what lies beneath.
His gaze bore into her, making her shift uncomfortably. As the festival continued around her, Claire felt herself growing increasingly drawn to Victor and his haunting creations. The more she watched him carve, the more captivated she became by the transformations. His hands moved with precision, almost as if the pumpkin itself guided his blade, revealing not just shapes but emotions. Fear, sorrow, madness.
Would you like to try?
He asked suddenly, his voice low and inviting.
I could teach you.
She hesitated, glancing back at the lively festival, children racing by, couples laughing, friends sharing hot cider. But something about the carving booth held her, like a moth to a flame. The thrill of the unknown whispered in her ear, urging her to accept.
All right.
She said, her voice trembling slightly. He handed her a small knife, its blade glinting menacingly under the string lights.
Let's see what your pumpkin reveals.
As Claire began to carve, the world around her faded. Each cut was more than just a slice through flesh. It felt like a release, a channeling of her innermost fears and regrets. With every twist of the blade, visions danced in her mind, her past mistakes, the relationships she'd ruined, the pain she carried like a weight on her chest.
What do you see?
Victor's voice pulled her from the depths of her thoughts.
What's inside your pumpkin?
I don't know.
She admitted, her voice a whisper. She felt vulnerable, exposed, as if she were carving not just the pumpkin, but also herself.
Dig deeper.
He urged, his eyes alight with an unsettling fervor.
You must unearth the truth.
As the hours slipped away, the square began to empty, leaving only Claire and Victor, surrounded by a growing pile of orange guts and remnants of their work. Claire's heart raced with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. The pumpkin in front of her had transformed into a grotesque reflection of her soul, its features twisted and warped, echoing her darkest thoughts. Suddenly she stopped, staring in horror at what she had created. The pumpkin grinned back at her, its smile wide and malevolent, as if it knew her secrets.
No!
She gasped, trembling.
This isn't right.
Victor stepped closer, his presence overwhelming.
This is your truth, Claire. You've been running from it for too long.
Panic surged through her.
I need to stop. I can't do this.
Ah, but you're already too deep.
He said, his tone chilling.
You can't escape what you've carved.
In that moment, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. The laughter from the festival faded, replaced by a haunting silence that engulfed her. She glanced around, her heart pounding, and saw that the square was empty. The vibrant colors drained away, leaving only shadows behind.
Help!
She screamed, but the sound echoed back, hollow and alone. Victor loomed closer, a twisted smile spreading across his face.
You wanted to see what lies beneath, didn't you?
With a jolt, Claire dropped the knife, her hands shaking violently.
I don't want this.
But it was too late. The pumpkin's eyes glowed with a sinister light, and in that moment, Claire felt the darkness consume her. She realized the truth. Victor hadn't just been carving pumpkins, he had been carving pieces of her soul. The festival lights flickered, and the whispers of her past filled the air. She had been drawn to the darkness, not to escape it, but because it had always been a part of her. As her consciousness slipped away, Claire understood with a chilling clarity that the pumpkin had become her reflection, a grotesque reminder of who she had truly become. In that final moment, as the shadows enveloped her, she heard Victor's laughter echo in the night. and the world fell silent.
Candy of your past. Lily stood in front of the counter of a small candy shop she had never noticed before. It was tucked away at the edge of town, a place that seemed out of sync with the world around it. The window display was filled with colorful, ornate jars, each brimming with different types of candies. But what caught her eye was a package of assorted sweets behind the counter. The packaging was simple, yet strangely nostalgic, a faded label with the words "Memories of Youth" printed on it in looping old-fashioned script. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a soft smile, noticed Lily's interest.
"Ah, those are special,"
she said quietly, sliding the package toward her.
"Every piece unlocks a taste of your past. Be careful not to eat too much at once."
Lily laughed it off, thinking the shopkeeper was playing into some marketing gimmick. Intrigued, she purchased the candy and headed home. She wasn't a big candy person, but something about these sweets tugged at her curiosity. Later that evening, Lily unwrapped her first piece of candy. It was a hard, red confection, shaped like a tiny heart. The moment it touched her tongue, she felt an immediate rush, a wave of nostalgia so powerful that she closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. She was 8 years old again, sitting in her grandmother's kitchen. The scent of freshly baked cookies filled the air. Her grandmother was laughing, her warm, loving presence filling the room. It was a cherished memory, one Lily hadn't thought about in years. But something was off. As the memory lingered, it began to twist. Her grandmother's smile faltered, and her laughter turned into a slow, unsettling wheeze. The room seemed to darken at the edges, the warmth draining away, replaced by a creeping coldness that settled in Lily's chest. She opened her eyes, gasping for air. Her grandmother, once filled with life, now stood before her, eyes sunken, her mouth twisting into a silent scream. The corners of the room warped, shadows stretching like claws along the walls. Lily jolted upright, the candy dissolving on her tongue. Her heart raced. What had that been? She shook her head, trying to brush it off as an overactive imagination. But deep down, something inside her stirred uneasily. Over the next few days, curiosity got the better of her. She found herself reaching for the candy more often, each piece revealing a different memory from her childhood, her first day at school, playing with friends in the park, her 10th birthday. But every memory held a dark undercurrent, a shadow lurking at the edges. There were small details she didn't remember, moments that felt wrong, twisted, as if the memories had been tainted. As the memories began to emerge, flashes of suppressed recollections crept in, hazy, unsettling images that sent shivers down her spine. She started to recall whispers from the past, faint echoes of laughter mixed with distant cries that seemed to echo through her house at night. The more she ate, the stranger things became. Her reality started to blur with the past. She'd find herself staring at old photos for hours, trying to reconcile the memories with what the candy had shown her. She began hearing voices in her house, faint whispers that grew louder after dusk, as though the walls themselves were speaking in tongues, revealing long-buried secrets. The lines between her memories and her present life began to blur, and then came the nightmares. Lily dreamt of her childhood home, but it was different, darker, decayed, as if abandoned for years. She saw herself as a child, running down the halls, but something chased her, a shadowy figure she could never quite see, but could feel watching, waiting. One night she awoke to the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter coming from the hall. Heart pounding, she scrambled out of bed and searched the house, but nothing was there, just the cold stillness of her empty home. One evening, after a particularly vivid nightmare, Lily couldn't resist the pull of the candy. She unwrapped another piece, her hands trembling. As soon as she tasted it, she was pulled into a memory she had forgotten, or perhaps repressed. She was 5 years old, standing in the backyard of her childhood home. There was a swing set, one she had played on countless times, but this time she wasn't alone. Another figure stood behind her, a little girl she didn't recognize. They were playing together, laughing. But as Lily watched the memory unfold, the laughter stopped. The little girl turned toward her, her face pale and her eyes hollow.
"Do you remember me?"
she asked. Lily's stomach twisted in fear. Suddenly, the memory shattered, and Lily was back in her living room, gasping for air. She had dropped the candy on the floor, but the taste lingered, bitter on her tongue. She knew that girl. She had seen her before. But where? The answer came to her in a wave of horror. The little girl wasn't a stranger. She was a reflection of herself, her younger self, a part of her past she had buried deep. Lily's obsession with the candy grew. Each piece pulled her deeper into forgotten memories, unlocking secrets she had long since buried. The girl in her memories appeared more often now, her presence growing stronger with each bite. With every taste, Lily felt a gnawing sense of dread creeping in, a growing awareness that something terrible had happened in her past, something she had erased from her mind. She tried to rationalize her feelings, telling herself she was just a child at the time, but deep down she knew the truth. What she had done was inexcusable. Flashes of memory became more vivid, showcasing moments that revealed her intent and premeditation. She remembered how she had planned her horrific act, how she had reveled in her secrecy, and how even then she understood that nobody would suspect an innocent little girl of such darkness. The girl in the memories was a reminder of Lily's guilt, a dark secret she couldn't escape. Every piece of candy forced her to relive it again and again, each taste consuming more of her. Lily realized too late that the candy wasn't just unlocking her past, it was consuming her, feeding on her regrets and guilt. The more she ate, the more the lines between past and present blurred. Her reflection in the mirror began to change, her eyes growing darker, her skin pale and hollow. She was becoming the hollow version of herself, the same figure she had seen in her nightmares. As Halloween night approached, the whispers in her house grew louder, filled with mockery and sorrow. The little girl appeared more frequently in her dreams, urging Lily to remember, to confront what she had buried. The weight of her guilt pressed heavily on her heart, and she knew the time had come to face her past. On Halloween night, Lily found herself standing in front of her childhood home, which now appeared even more decayed and sinister in the moonlight. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of trick-or-treaters. The house loomed over her like a tombstone of forgotten memories, and the faint smell of smoke seemed to linger in the air. With trembling hands, she pulled out the last piece of candy from her pocket, a dark, twisted confection that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The girl's laughter echoed in her mind, coaxing her to take a bite. She hesitated, heart pounding, knowing this was her last chance to reclaim the past. As she bit into the candy, memories flooded back, clear and vivid. She was 5 years old, smiling and laughing as she swung high on the swing set. But then came the shadows, the horror of what she had done, the cold realization that she had acted with intent, burying her guilt beneath a facade of innocence. In that moment of catharsis, Lily felt a shift within her. The memories coalesced into a haunting understanding. She had not only been a participant, but had also crafted the horror of that fateful day. The little girl's hollow eyes watched her with a knowing gaze, and in a final act of redemption, Lily stepped into the house, ready to face the consequences of her past. As she slipped into the darkness, the street where Lily's childhood home stood grew brighter. The soft yellow glow of Halloween decorations now seemed to complement the flames licking at the sides of the house. The fire grew larger, turning the home into a macabre ornament, consuming the memory of the unspeakable horror she had fought so long to repress, brought to life by a strange box of candy.
Uninvited Costumes.
It was a perfect Halloween night. The kind of night where the autumn air was crisp and every house on the block was decked out with glowing pumpkins, fake cobwebs, and makeshift graveyards. Mia and her friends had been planning this costume party for weeks, and tonight, it was finally happening. The party was in full swing. Mia, dressed as a gothic vampire, danced in the living room with her best friends, all laughing and celebrating. The music was loud, the lights dim, and everyone was decked out in their Halloween best. Mia's house, filled with the smell of cinnamon and pumpkin, felt warm, cozy, and alive with the buzz of conversation and laughter. At some point during the night, Mia noticed more people arriving. It was odd because she had only invited a handful of friends, about 10 in total, but the crowd had nearly doubled. The new guests wore elaborate costumes, far more detailed than anyone else at the party. There was a woman in a Victorian dress, her face hidden behind a white porcelain mask, a tall, hulking figure in medieval knight's armor, and a clown with smeared makeup, its grin impossibly wide. Mia glanced around the room. No one seemed to know these people. She assumed they were friends of friends, strangers brought along for fun. That kind of thing happened at Halloween parties, right? As the night wore on, she became increasingly uneasy. The newcomers weren't mingling, weren't eating or drinking, just standing around, watching. She tried to strike up a conversation with one of them, a woman dressed in a tattered wedding gown. But when she approached, the woman didn't move or respond. Mia waved her hand in front of the woman's face. Nothing. A chill ran down her spine. These new guests weren't acting like normal people. Feeling uneasy, she scanned the room. The new guests, the Victorian woman, the knight, the clown, none of them were interacting with anyone. And as she looked closer, she realized something else. They weren't breathing. She reached out, gently touching the Victorian woman's arm. Cold, hard. She knocked lightly on the figure's chest, hollow. Her stomach flipped. There was no one inside. She rushed back to her best friend, Sarah, and whispered,
Sarah, those people, they're not real. They're not people. They're just costumes.
Sarah blinked in confusion.
What do you mean? The costumes.
Mia insisted, her voice growing frantic.
There's nothing inside them. They're empty.
Sarah's face paled as she looked across the room, her eyes wide as she began to see it too. The way the clown stood too still, the Victorian woman's mask hiding an empty void, the knight's armor making no sound when it moved. Mia's heart raced. These costumes were just shells, empty, but somehow alive. She grabbed Sarah's hand.
We need to get out of here.
But as they moved toward the front door, the knight suddenly shifted, blocking their exit. Mia's blood ran cold. The figure hadn't moved like a person. It slid into place, as if gliding on air. The other costumes began to follow suit, drifting toward Mia and Sarah in a slow, deliberate circle.
What do they want?
Sarah whispered, her voice trembling.
I don't know.
Mia gasped. Panic surged through her, her eyes darting toward the back door. But it too was blocked, this time by the clown, standing eerily still, its empty grin stretched wide. The music faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. In every flash of light, the costumes seemed to move closer, tightening their circle around the guests. She turned to the other partygoers, her friends, only to see them frozen, their eyes wide with terror, but unable to move or speak. It was as if the costumes had drained them of their will. She could feel the air getting heavier. She backed toward a corner, pulling Sarah with her. but then she felt Sarah's hand slip from her grasp. Mia turned, horrified, as Sarah stood rigid and unmoving, her face blank. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow like the costumes that surrounded her. And then Mia noticed Sarah wasn't wearing her own costume anymore. She was wearing one of them. Mia screamed, stumbling backward. The costumes, these empty, lifeless shells, were taking her friends. One by one, the guests were absorbed into the costumes, becoming part of the collection. The people she had known moments ago were now hollow. The lights flickered again, and this time, when they came back on, the room was almost completely empty. The costumes were gone. The guests were gone. All that remained was Mia, standing alone in the silence, her heart racing. She ran outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath, glancing back at her house, half expecting to see the costumes watching from the windows. But the house was dark, quiet, lifeless. The next day, she returned with the police, but her house was eerily silent. There were no signs of the party, no costumes, no guests, nothing. The house felt empty, lifeless. Mia tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. How could they? As she stood on the front porch, staring blankly at the house, her phone buzzed. It was a notification, a photo someone had tagged her in on social media. Confused, she opened it. Her heart sank. It was a photo from the party. Everyone was in the picture, her friends laughing and dancing. But standing among them, staring directly at the camera, were the hollow costumes. And behind them, barely visible in the background, was her own face, peeking out from inside one of the costumes. Her eyes were hollow.
Thank you for joining us tonight in the Haunt Vault. We hope these stories have left you with a few chills to carry beyond Halloween night. If you enjoyed our tales, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll never miss a journey into the shadows with us. Until next time, stay curious and beware what lurks just beyond the light.